Hi, geeks! My name is Ani Liu, and I'm a researcher and artist, and I am so happy to be here with you today, sharing our ideas together. Today, I'm going to talk about my work through the lens of research. I call myself a research-based artist, and sometimes that sounds kind of vague, so I'm hoping to show my works and the process and thinking behind them.
GEEX, the Glass Education Exchange, welcomes Ani Liu to the GEEX Talks lecture series. A few special guests, Kim Harty and former GEEX Talks speaker Kimberly Thomas, will also be featured later on. Thanks to Wet Dog Glass for sponsoring this episode. Before we begin, here's a few words from Wet Dog Glass.
I often make art and design work in untraditional environments, such as a laboratory, using the tools of science and technology to investigate themes that artists and designers have always investigated, themes of longing, nostalgia, sexuality, what it means to be human. At the core of my work, I deeply believe that while we shape our technologies co-shape us, and this feedback loop is a very important one to examine. And I used to have a little poster of this picture that I would literally take from each studio, and I would just tape it on each studio, and it got super stained and wrinkled, but it was always in the corner of my eye. I thought I'd introduce myself with some of the spaces that I've lived and worked because it informs my practice. This is a photo of Flushing, Queens, an enclave in New York City where a lot of Chinese and Korean immigrants live and thrive. And this is where I mostly grew up, in a vibrant community of hardworking immigrants, including my parents. And I've always been drawn to art, but growing up in the neighborhoods that I did, it just seemed impossible to become an artist. So I went to architecture school, and this is the inside of the Graduate School of Design where I spent many years. And this is a picture of my desk. I think you can kind of tell that I probably wasn't going to become an architect. I had all these kind of experimental machines and random things that I was building all the time. And I did my thesis project on wearable technology. I was really interested in virtuality, simulations, and the augmented body. And that work led me to the MIT Media Lab, which looks like this. And while I was there, I did work in synthetic biology and perfumery. In a way, it was an extension of my interest in the cyborg body, but on a cellular level. So in my journey, I worked in architecture, technology, biological design, and art. The nerdy part of me is really interested in how things work and how knowledge is made. And the feeling part of me has its pulse on the body politics of emerging technologies. And I think like all of us, right, we have so many titles and hats and we do so many different things. But most significantly of all, I'm also a mother. And the experience of having and raising my children has changed my life and practice profoundly and continues to do so. And I hope to show some works that showcase that.
This season, GEEX Talks will feature segments on speakers' artwork, artistic practice, and direct conversations with the community. In this episode, Ani Liu will discuss the making of 3 pieces, followed by a workshop question, studio tour, a biosketch, some advice, a lightning round of rapid-fire questions, and another question from the community.
So many of my projects start with a few questions, often one conceptual and one formal. And by formal, I mean, what are the questions related to the form, right? Like as an artist, we think a lot about materiality and color and texture. So this project that I wanted to started with this set of questions. Why is paid parental leave so important, and how can data be made visceral? And perhaps many of you know this, but the United States has terrible support for families who have a baby. There's no countrywide policy for paid postpartum leave after you have a baby. And it's super important. So for medical reasons, I recorded how often my daughter was fed and changed for the first 30 days after she was born. So this is a chart from top to bottom are the 24 hours of a day, and from left to right, the days of the month. And you can see I didn't do a lot of sleeping. There's this amazing graphic artist named Leanna Fink that I love, and I think she captures it best with this caption, like, my amazing vacation from emails. Even well-meaning colleagues will be like, oh, you're so lucky you get to go on maternity or parental leave. It's like a free vacation, but it's like, oh, welcome to my vacation. So this is a sculpture that I made based on the data that you saw in the previous slide. Each vial represents a diaper change or a feeding session. And from top to bottom, the 24 hours of a day, from left to right, the 30 days of the month. And depending on what's in the vial, it represents whether it was a feeding session or a cleaning session. And as an artist, I've been recording and trying to make sense of my own transition and experiences in parenthood through the material culture of my own experiences with breast milk and diapers and formula and breast pumps. And in this sculpture, each vial contains those materials, breast milk, formula, diaper fragments, to mark the associated activities of feeding and cleaning. This is an image of some of the material tests that I did to make breast milk shelf stable for the exhibition. One of the reasons I was so keen on bringing breast milk into the context of a gallery is because these quote unquote domestic materials associated with care is still relatively rare to see, both because exhibition spaces were historically dominated by men and because breastfeeding is fairly invisible labor. And I learned that breastfeeding is made to be invisible labor. It wasn't until 2018 that all 50 states in the US made breastfeeding in public legal. Idaho and Utah were the last states to pass the law, and previously breastfeeding in public could be seen as indecent exposure and you could be fined for it, which was just wild to me. It feels like 2018 was yesterday. And in parallel, Facebook censored breastfeeding until as recently as 2014 because its algorithms still occasionally censor breastfeeding images due to its censorship policy towards female nipples. And so just zooming back on the work, it's a data portrait, but it was really important for me to include breast milk as a material for these reasons. And through this work, I felt like I was telling a very personal story about my own experiences, but it's also kind of a universal story about the invisible labor of care work. So continuing my journey in reflecting on my experiences with parenthood, the conceptual questions were like, can technology both liberate and inhibit? And formally, what does a portrait of pumping breast milk feel and sound like? So the next project I'm going to show makes the labor of lactating quite overt. In this sculpture, I calculated the amount of milk that I produced in a day, a week, and a month. Shown here is the amount produced in a week, approximately 1.5 gallons. And the milk in the sculpture runs on a rhythm, the rhythm of my breast pump. My own relationship to the breast pump is a result of our lack of paid parental leave policies in the US. At my current job, just a few days after I gave birth, I returned to work and became very intimate with my pump. Whereas usually the stimulation that causes letdown, the phenomena by which milk gets released from your breast, is usually caused by looking at your baby's cute face or the feeling of their suckle. I started to let down just by hearing the sound of my pump. Like, I became kind of like biologically conditioned to do so. Going back to my experiences pumping, I had this kind of interesting moment where I felt like I was living Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, in which human, animal, and machine were becoming blurred. A machine was enabling me to continue to feed my baby, an intensely animal instinct, but also a machine was also causing me to release hormonal triggers usually reserved for a baby. And I became intimately entangled with it. Like, the sound of the machine would just trigger all the oxytocin and the prolactin. And it was really interesting. Like, I felt sensations of love when I heard this mechanical sound. I showed a previous slide that showed how breastfeeding in public wasn't legal in all 50 states until 2018. Breastfeeding, of course, is ancient. We're considered mammals, one of the defining characteristics, which is to have mammary glands to produce milk. And there are many health benefits for an infant to drink breast milk, and now it's scientifically understood as one of the best foods for an infant. Breastfeeding is not just food, but also a form of communication. When an infant latches onto the breast, some of their saliva actually enters the nipple, which kind of blew my mind. They form a little vacuum with their mouth, and some of the saliva goes into my body. And my body reads that information. So my milk becomes adapted specifically for them. So for instance, if they're sick, my body makes the specific antibodies for their illness. But it's also cultural. Like if I eat a lot of kimchi in my diet, then molecules of those kind of taste molecules enter the milk. And then my baby learns that the taste of kimchi is like a culturally acceptable and loved thing. And so there's a lot of this kind of communication back and forth through milk. But because motherhood tends to be a very judgmental space full of shaming and stigmatization, I wanted to say, frankly, that I think breast milk is fascinating and amazing, and I make work about it, but I'm not a breastfeeding purist. I certainly fed formula and breast milk and just anything that kept my baby fed. And I think that people choose to breastfeed or not for very complex reasons. I just wanted to state this explicitly, that while this work is about breast milk, I think it's important to support all parents in all the ways that feeding happens. So I became really interested, in the kind of like cultural, economic, and political conditions that impact such personal details about my life. And I started to look at the history of the breast pump. The breast pump was first patented in 1854. And I think it immediately offered so many complex potentials, right? Both liberating and limiting. Its presence allows for this kind of disentanglement of body and milk, which can empower, right? Like, for instance, I no longer have to be attached to my infant. I can do all kinds of things and still feed them. I can produce breast milk. I can return to the workforce. However, while breast pumping technology has advanced, the cultural and political stances around them haven't caught up. So does the existence of this technology obligate postpartum bodies back into the labor force with the assumption that all spectrums of society can balance the demands of paid work and care work? Employers are now mandated to give workers a space for lactation, but it's often nothing more than a broom closet with a taped-on sign that says pumping room. And this is a photo series by artist Corinne Botts that I love, who has been photographing the real spaces where real working women pumped. So to quote Matilda Cohen in her analysis of these photographs, the compositions focus on the materiality of the space, the pump, and the bottles of expressed milk. Women are conspicuously missing from the frame. Babies only appear as pictures within the pictures. This double absence of mothers and their children highlights our society's preference for human milk as a disembodied product, rather than an affective relationship. Why else do laws and policies facilitate lactation through the provision of breaks, rooms, and pumps, implying the separation of parents and children? Through my own experiences with pumping and breastfeeding, I too became entangled in a vast network of invisible care. The invisible labor of feeding, washing dirty bottles, sterilizing, pumping. In the first month, babies can eat every 1 to 3 hours for 10 to 20 minutes per breast. A mother can spend between 5 to 8 hours a day breastfeeding or pumping. In the formula shortage, a lot of internet commenters have said things like, why don't women just breastfeed? Breastfeeding is free. But breastfeeding is only free if you believe women's time is valueless. Another project in this series: what happens when the government considers bodies as reproductive machines, and what might an artificial womb look like? Perhaps you've already seen it in the news. Currently, the birth rate has been dropping in countries such as the US, China, and Korea. It's become a crisis for some governments because economies need bodies to thrive. Bodies meaning workers, laborers, consumers, and soldiers. I just want to pause here and acknowledge that we're facing a climate change crisis, and not everyone wants to have a baby, and that should be their choice. I think we should think of alternative ways to spark economic growth that doesn't depend on population growth. But as it is right now, governments are very concerned about their population decline, and I think we can trace a path from the control of population production to the control of bodies with uteruses. The right to abortion is becoming overturned, or has been overturned in the US, and bodies with uteruses are facing more regulations. And I think it is reflected through systemic gender inequality, which might include things like wage disparity, educational attainment, the right to vote, to own property and other assets, and even lack of legal protection over rape and domestic violence. So this was the political backdrop in which I was thinking about artificial wombs. A few years ago, I was reading Shulamith Firestone, and she said something to the extent of, as long as women carry the burden of reproductive labor, there can never be true gender equality. And this quote kind of sat with me. And I kept wondering, could an artificial womb change that? What if technology took over this quote unquote burden of reproductive labor? And while most conventional depictions are mechanical, I started to wonder, what if the future of artificial wombs weren't welded but grown? And I learned about interspecific pregnancy, where one species can carry a pregnancy for another species. And at least according to Wikipedia, we actually did this with cats to try to bolster the populations of endangered pandas. So I started to research pigs as a potential surrogate for an artificial womb. After all, we've already engineered pigs to produce human organs. What if we engineered a pig to become surrogate to human fetuses? Would such a technology equalize this kind of biopolitical desire for population growth and free women's bodies? But as I dove into the research, I started to feel super uneasy. Wasn't this just a form of colonization over another species' body? And I guess I want to say it's not my intention to say that an artificial womb would solve all of our troubles. In fact, I think we don't need necessarily technological innovation. I think we need better systemic support, such as paid parental leave and subsidized childcare. But this project is meant to spark discussion. So what you're seeing here is the uterus of a pig. This is a speculative uterus that has been genetically engineered to carry human babies. And so, again, kind of drawing these parallels between birthing bodies as a societal utility, similar to farm animals. During the research, I learned that the surrogacy would be more successful when the fetuses were implanted with both species. So the work alternates between human fetuses and little piglets. Surrogacy is not simple. It can allow same-sex couples to have a child, empower women to help those in need, and exploit the health of those in poverty all at once. And this is a version of the sculpture which the whole pig has been articulated. And I hope the project asks for you that, perhaps we don't need these kind of techno-utopian answers to gender equality. We need policy changes that can make room economically and culturally for reproductive health. And I love it when young audiences encounter the work and the conversations that it provokes.
Hi, I'm Kim Harty, and I'm an artist and educator in Detroit, Michigan. In pregnancy, birth, and early childhood, there is a lot of anxiety around what is natural versus unnatural. And I see that tension in your work in making things that are natural or just things that are common appear strange or almost alien. How do you think about what is natural, and how do you sort of cope with moralizing around ideas of naturalness or ideas of nature?
Hi, Kim. Thanks so much for the great question. It's actually something that I think about a lot, and it's so near and dear to my heart. So thanks for asking it so that I can contemplate it aloud with you. I felt so self-conscious when I was about to give birth to my first child. And I actually had this exact dilemma, I guess, around these words of natural, because people would ask me, people who I really love, who are very well-meaning, would ask me, are you going to have a natural birth? I was so stumped, what does it mean? And I think they meant some spectrum of, are you going to have a vaginal birth? Are you going to have an epidural? Are you going to give birth in a hospital? Are you going to have a C-section? Is a hospital vaginal birth natural? Is a birth in a home with a covered roof and HVAC natural? Is only giving birth in a field uncovered or in a cave natural? Where's that spectrum end? And I think when you start to kind of pick it apart, you realize that to be human is to use tools. To be human is to innovate and do all of the things that, give us joy and meaning and all of these things. So I think the issue perhaps isn't whether something is natural or not, but to kind of evaluate where the judgmental aspect comes from. And I'm literally kind of thinking aloud on this because it's a question that's so dear to my heart. And around that time, I came across an article by Jessica Gross that I really loved, and it's called Why We Will Never Use the Term Natural Birth. And I think it was in the New York Times. And it really made me think so much about it because I think a lot too about not just about birth or motherhood, which is so loaded when it comes to natural, but also notions of beauty or effortlessness. It's interesting because I feel like all the beauty trends right now is to look beautiful, quote unquote, naturally. And there's all of this makeup called no makeup makeup. And the idea that we must force a certain kind of people to appear to do lots of invisible labor so that it appears to be effortless, to be a certain way or to perform a certain way is so unfortunate. I remember when I was reading a lot of media theory in grad school, I started to really question what technology is, because at that time, I was working a lot with Google Glass or virtual reality or augmented reality, which at the time was very cutting edge. So everyone knew this is technology. But then I was talking to someone, they were like, also, all these invisible things are also technology, like a pencil or the concept of writing or money or fire, things that as we become more used to it, become more invisible. And we take for granted the ways that they're influencing us. So I think it's kind of interesting to peel it back because, like I said, I think it's just a core part of being a human animal to create tools. And it's such an integral part of us. And so a lot of times, if I have a knee jerk reaction to something, if I feel something is like natural or unnatural, or maybe at the root of it, if I feel like a twinge of jealousy, I think, oh, what am I actually responding to here? And I try to remind myself that even when it looks effortless, we're all struggling somewhere, somehow. Welcome to my studio. I just wanted to show you my current work desk. I'm actually in the process of a really prolonged renovation, so this is kind of a makeshift studio desk for a project that I'm doing right now, and I wanted to share with you some of the processes. So for the project that I'm doing right now, I've been distilling microplastics from my body, specifically from my breast milk. In 2022, I found this amazing paper that showed that breast milk from mothers contained microplastics, which was incredibly devastating. Because at the time I was spending all this time and energy breastfeeding and pumping. And for me, it was very physically painful and took a lot out of me. And then when I read about the microplastics, it was so devastating. Of course, now we have found microplastics in everything from blood to saliva to urine. It's just pervasively everywhere. But at the time, I was specifically interested in the microplastics in our breast milk, because I'm thinking a lot about, I don't know, all the ways that we regulate reproductive bodies with uteruses, but the ways that we don't regulate pollution from big companies and corporations. So this is a work in progress, and I'm still thinking through it. But I've kind of cobbled together all of my supplies with grants and collaborations with amazing scientists at Rockefeller University, including Jen Bond. And I wanted to show how artists can also use unconventional equipment at home to do interesting things. I just wanted to walk you through my lab space, my temporary lab space where I'm conducting a project. At the moment, I'm doing a project where I'm distilling microplastics from my own body. And I'll just walk you through this kind of DIY citizen science lab. Just a little overview. This is my computer station where I do a lot of the research and grant writing. I also paint here. I've been doing a lot of watercolor painting. This is the stand. And so the process behind distilling microplastics mostly involves first putting on the safety equipment, of course, gloves and goggles, and then transferring specific amounts of liquids, which can be done with a pipette, which looks like this, and these are the pipette tips over there. And then the sample, in my case, breast milk, is pipetted into test tubes, which are here, and they're labeled. These are old test tubes that I've already used. And then after the sample is pipetted into the test tube, we basically need to use something to digest the organic compounds, like all of the sugars, the fat, the proteins. And so what I use is KOH, potassium hydroxide, which I make with a powder and distilled water. And so this is a gram scale to make it really nice and precise. And then it's incubated. Actually, I don't have my egg incubator. I'll be sharing a photo of it. It's incubated at a specific temperature and agitated at equal increments. And then the whole sample is filtered through this flask filter. And so basically I'm using a glass filter that has a specific, this is the glass filters. I'll open it up so you can see. The pore size is a specific diameter. And then the sample gets, so the filter gets put in there, and then the sample gets poured in here, and then a vacuum pulls the sample down. And then afterwards, the filter disc is dried, and then we can look at it under the microscope. And you can see here one of the samples that I've distilled, and you can see what appears to be a microplastic. In fact, it's blue. And I'm in the process of collaborating with scientists to use different lab tools such as spectroscopy to figure out what type of plastic that is. So for instance, is it polyethylene? Is it polyvinyl chloride? And this is from a paper that does just this, distills microplastics from breast milk, and you use Raman spectroscopy to analyze the samples. And so after all of the lab work comes the hard part, which is actually making the art, to think about the kind of emotional and ethical and cultural and existential implications of finding microplastics in your body. So this is kind of my setup, and I've been running, at this point, almost 100 samples through it. So this is just one part of the process, right? Like first the kind of laboratory work, the exploration, the collaboration, and then comes the hard part of actually making the art. Like how do you tell the story in a kind of like mindful way that doesn't spread panic? Like what type of systemic change can we actually achieve through knowledge? These are the things that I'm kind of working out right now. So I wanted to share a little bit more about my practice and why I became so obsessed with this quote, "We shape our tools and our tools shape us," by Marshall McLuhan. And as I mentioned, I'm an artist that works a lot in a laboratory using possibly unconventional tools like laboratory tools or technological tools to investigate those themes that I think all artists are interested in. But I think my interest in tools started in architecture school. I showed this image of my desk at architecture school, but I was the last generation of architects, I think, that they trained using hand drafting. So using tracing paper and the Mayline to learn how to draw a plan and then use projective geometry to turn into a 3D drawing. And I was totally obsessed with that, really interested. And then in the same breath, I was also trained to use a computer to make these drawings and to 3D model. And not only that, to write code, to parametrically design. And I was also trained in very traditional ways of making, like figure sculpting with clay, and also learned how to 3D print and use a 3D scanner. And I became so interested in the difference between sculpting something by hand with a model in front of you versus 3D scanning the model and 3D printing that person. And so that relationship between how are the tools that I'm using to make the things changing the way that I'm thinking and relating to it. As I mentioned, the year that I graduated from architecture school, Google Glass had just come out, Oculus Rift had just come out, Tinder had just come out, and it really changed the way that we were perceiving both the experience of public space and socializing. I remember people saying things like, now that we have Tinder, bars will go out of business because we won't need to go there anymore to meet people. And I thought that was so interesting. And it's funny because since the pandemic, we've learned that it's actually kind of essential for us to see each other with our bodies and our whole selves. But that relationship between how these technologies are impacting such intimate dimensions of our lives was very interesting to me. And I was reflecting on it, and I think that a lot of this interest comes from a lifelong fascination with perception. So I think that maybe it's a good space to start in terms of thinking about the impact of technology on society. Perception is really interesting because in cognitive science, we learned that what our eyes see and the world that we perceive are really different. what you see, like for instance, this is what your retina sees. The images are upside down. There are blood vessels all over the way of your sensors. There's a blind spot. So this is what the raw information that your eyeball gets. But of course, when we see the world, it doesn't look like this, right? Our brain does a thing where it kind of filters all of this information and unscrambles it. It makes it right side up again. It gets rid of the blind spot because our eyes move around and it samples the world. And then it changes it into the images that it thinks we ought to see. And that's how a lot of visual illusions work. Our eyes are constantly moving and sampling new information, and then our brain builds the complete picture based on missing information. And so our brain constantly has to work to build this trustworthy reality based on our sensory input. And we generate perceptions from this. And I think that this is a really important part of being an artist. We actually create some of that sensory input, right? Like we create the context of the sensory input. But to kind of drive it home, I really wanted to really learn more about perception. And so there's a concept known as perceptual adaptation. And there's a scientist named George M. Stratton who discovered this back in 1890. And he did all these experiments, which I recreated because I was curious. So I designed this set of goggles that allows you to see the world upside down. And interestingly, so when you wear them, everything is upside down. It makes you kind of nauseated and dizzy, and you walk into chairs and doors, which I did. And interestingly, if you wear them for 3 days straight, your brain re-scrambles the images. So the whole upside down world becomes right side up again, because your brain, based on all of the information you've gotten since you were born, knows that this is what the world should be like. So it takes those perceptions, that raw input, and then it re-scrambles it based on what you've learned in the past. And I thought that this was somewhat radical in a way, because we live our lives based on the assumptions. And this is not just perception, right? Like this is not just upside downness. Like if you were taught your whole life that women shouldn't be able to vote, then maybe you would take it for granted. You're like, oh yeah, of course women shouldn't be able to vote. So these kind of contexts, they really prime our reality and our behavior. And so back to this quote, right? The world changes us. We change the world changes us, the tools shape us, and we shape our tools. And so my work really touches on that. Like, how does the existence of the breast pump change my notions of feminism? How does that change my relationship to work and motherhood? What are the invisible aspects of that kind of relationship? I studied at MIT, and I felt super lucky because I constantly got to hang out with brilliant scientists who did so many amazing things. They studied things like synthetic neurobiology, sculpted evolution, everything from AI to artificial life. And I remember my mentor at the time, Sputniko, she would say that across campus, brilliant scientists are working in their labs to make the world a better place. And part of your job as an artist is to ask, what is better? What is better for you, for me, for a Black woman, a gay man, a retired veteran, a kindergartner in a wheelchair? The notion of good is not neutral. Good is shaped by all of those contexts, right? The social, political, emotional, economic contexts. And so I think that's an important part of my practice as an artist. I think that artists and designers can raise critical questions. And I think that art can be how we see and feel the future and the world. And that's something I always strive to do, to kind of continue to peel back the layers of technology and ask, how is it shaping us? How are we shaping it? Guidance, practical tips for students. Okay, so I teach both undergrads and graduate students, and I'm always thinking about what to tell students who want to become artists, because it is so tough. So I think the best and possibly most straightforward advice I've ever gotten is just to keep making the work. It's the most important thing. I know it sounds so simple, but after you graduate, it can be so hard to do so. There are no longer professors and classes and critiques and friends to constantly make and think art with. So making the art, it's number one. Without it, there's nothing, right? Like you can't be an artist without the art. It helps me to develop a routine. There was a time in my practice where I went to my studio every morning from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. before work. I had this day job, and then I would go again from 7 p.m. until midnight. Every Monday, I carved out some time from my studio practice for grant writing. Thursday afternoons I set aside for art-related meetings, and weekends were always for art viewing. I would go to all the galleries and the museum. My work week is really different now. It's carved out between teaching and taking care of my family and young kids. But the concept is the same. Like in my calendar, I block out it's like I want to say it's almost like religious. It's like an untouchable block of time that is for making art. Like no calls, everything on silent, do not disturb mode. And even if it's just 45 minutes, because I know life is hard, life is complicated. After I had my kids, there was a time when the only time I could make art was literally between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. And that was it. But that's what I did. And so creating a routine, I think, really helps because you just get into the habit and you don't even have to think about it. It's like, oh, this is my time. I'm going to do it. I'm going to put on. Oh, you know what else helps me is to have a ritual. I have a little studio jacket. And when I put on my studio jacket, it's like art making time. And then at the end, I take off my studio jacket and then I do all the other normal human things that I do. But making the work, whatever it takes for you, whether it's lighting a candle that smells a certain way and that triggers the Pavlovian response, like this is my art making time, whatever it takes for you. Something else that a mentor told me when I was younger that was helpful when I was starting out was don't expect your art to pay the bills right away. It's too much pressure to put on your art. Find a job that you can do that doesn't exhaust you at the end of the day so you can keep making the art. And this was really helpful to hear because I think there's so much pressure to make it, quote unquote, make it from the start right out of school. And sometimes it takes time for you to figure out your voice and how you want to express it. And sometimes it takes an entire lifetime. And I think if you keep making the work that you want to make and not the art that you think the market wants you to make, it will help you keep your sanity. Take care of your community and your friends. It's not a competition. I think we're all in it together. Like truly the number of people in the world that truly love art are so few. I think we need to take care of each other. I try to make it a rule for myself to recommend the work of one of my beloved peers to people who interview me, curators who visit me, collectors who want to buy the work. It's hard to make it alone out there. I think it's actually impossible. And I think we're in it together. I just want to tear down this myth of the solitary genius artist. Especially after you graduate, it's so lonely. So I think it's super important. Support each other. And maybe the last thing is don't be afraid to try new things. I think that if you become known for doing a certain thing, like maybe working with stone or working with wood, it's intimidating to try something like glass, which I did. And I immediately fell in love with it. It is very humbling to be such a novice after many years of practicing, but it's also so refreshing and wonderful. So try new things.
Okay, so next up we have the lightning round questions. How would you describe your work in 3 words?
3 words? Interrogative, emotional, contemplative.
How would you describe your work using 3 emojis?
Oh, 3 emojis. Whoa, okay. I think there's an emoji that is like a scientific glassware, like maybe it's an Erlenmeyer flask with green liquid in it. Definitely like a weather one, the one that has sparkles, although I guess sparkles isn't really weather, like the 3 sparkles, the thought bubble emoji, because I feel like I personally find that my work is successful if it makes someone rethink something about their life or the life that they live in.
What has been the biggest or best surprise that you've experienced in making and exhibiting your work?
Oh, I love meeting people at my exhibitions. I feel so lucky to have exhibitions at all, but the conversations often totally challenge me, transform the way I view the work. It's been so gratifying and humbling and just such a wonderful experience to talk to people about the work that came out of my studio, often work that takes years to make in kind of solitary conditions. That always brings so much joy and surprise to me.
If you weren't an artist, what would you be doing?
Ooh, I think about this all the time. I actually do think that I would love being a scientist. I think artists fail a lot and scientists fail a lot. And I like working with my hands. So definitely a kind of scientist that does a lot of bench work and probably a lot of wet liquid handling.
How has teaching affected your approach to making art?
I love returning to a space all the time, which you can really question everything. Why do we take this as the kind of accepted dogmatic truth? And Does it need to be reevaluated? I think those are the kind of questions that I can have with my students all the time that I find so valuable.
What would you consider the most important tool in your practice?
Ooh, the most important tool. That's a big one. Ooh, I'm so torn. Not that my library is a tool, but reading really informs a lot of the work, and drawing are really a way for me to think through my hand. But I have a lot of trouble making unless I can put pencil to paper. So possibly pencil and paper. That's a pretty critical tool, even more so than any saw or 3D printer.
This is kind of a similar one, but what are your most frequently used tools when moving from an idea into an exhibition?
Ooh, I make a lot of 3D models. When I'm preparing for an exhibition, I'll often go to the gallery or ask someone in the gallery to measure the whole gallery, and I make a 3D model of the whole space. And then I make 3D models of all of the artworks. Then I place them in the gallery to kind of create a conversation or a narrative. I use Rhino, so often the mouse, the keyboard, Rhino.
Do you have a favorite part of the scientific process?
Find repetitive tasks really soothing, actually. So the methods part, if it is a question on the impact of a certain chemical on this process, where you put like 0.1 milliliters and then 0.2 milliliters and then 0.3, and then you have the chart that shows all of the different outcomes based on the different input. Like, I love that part. And I would say that in art too, like even when most of the samples are aesthetically not hitting the mark, I love seeing the whole array of them. I like seeing that we've tested all the options and that this one feels right for some reason, because I feel like that is such a magical moment. So it's not even the part where you find a great result. I just like the process. I just like doing it.
Do you have a favorite researcher or scientific text that you keep coming back to?
Oh, there's an anthropologist named Emily Martin. I'm paraphrasing the title. It's called The Egg and the Sperm. And she talks about the biases in scientific papers. And it really opened my mind and made me more critical about what I was reading, because often when we read a paper, we take it as scientific fact, which is great because usually the authors have done their best to be objective. And if they have a conflict of interest, there's a part of the paper where they write about it. She was analyzing papers that used the word egg and sperm. And she noted really biased language, like the heroic journey of the sperm to the passive egg, which, if unfertilized, would slough off like garbage. These are papers that we take to be evidence-based truth. And so it made me realize that even though I think the scientific method is great and it's really important to continue to create evidence-based truths and continue to conduct good, sound scientific research, we also need to acknowledge that humans who live in a certain era with certain biases create this body of knowledge. And so, especially when we read older scientific papers, it's really important to put on that critical thinking cap.
My name is Kimberly Thomas, and I'm calling from Bakersfield, North Carolina. So, Annie, my first question is, why glass? Most specifically, I was looking at the piece with the pig and the human fetuses inside, and it's like an artificial kind of like sci-fi type of imagery. Do you think that making these works out of glass would dilute the meaning of the piece? My second question for you is, why are you interested in flame working? You took a class with me, and you could kind of have picked any way of working with glass, but you chose flame working. So I wanted to know how that really related to your practice.
Hi, Kim. Oh my gosh, it's so great to be in conversation with you. Thank you for being such an amazing teacher. I still vibrate with the energy of our class together. I love glass so much. I don't have nearly as much experience in glass as I would like, and I hope to spend the rest of my life working on it. But it was one of those things like falling in love. The first time I took a class and stood in front of the flame and tried not to burn myself, I just loved it. Like, my heart pounded, my palms sweat, and I felt like just so in the moment. I am someone who just tends to be really anxious and my mind goes in circles all the time. But when I'm working with glass, I have to be present. And I love that. it is this intense dance where you have to be mindful of so many components at the same time, or else it just cracks or explodes. I love the way it looks and feels. I love the experience of making it and working with glass. Trained as an architect, I used a lot of tools that just happened to use a lot of plastic, like laser cutting, CNCing, 3D printing. A lot of this is very heavy in plastic. In my work recently, I've started to really develop a new relationship to plastic. I really want to avoid it. I really want to think about its lasting impact and how forever these things are. When I started working with glass, it just, everything clicked into place. I was like, oh, there's another way to create these kind of transparent metaphors that don't require me to work with plastic. The first iteration I made actually was out of a plastic bag with sonogram gel. It's like a plastic bag and sonogram gel. And I was trying to quickly in my studio get the feel. And so after making a lot of prototypes with sonogram gel and basically plastic bags, I needed to make it more kind of shelf stable. Even then, I was thinking a lot about glass because it's very expensive to 3D print something of that scale and transparent. So I was looking also at vacuum forming. I was looking at making a mold to have someone blow glass into. I would love to remake that piece in glass because I'd be curious as to what it would look like. It's funny because I've done work about it because I think about it a lot. Like the difference between, for instance, molding something in clay. Like I had a very traditional arts education to some extent as an undergraduate where I learned how to figure sculpt in clay with my hands. And there's a kind of immediacy to it, right? Like if I'm in a bad mood, you can see the depth of those marks. And then when I went to architecture school, if I was in a bad mood, maybe I would click that mouse a little harder, but still the line would be perfectly straight. And I was thinking a lot about like, how do those kind of digital tools mediate and transform and translate the mark of the hand? Because despite that we all use similar keyboards and mice, there were definitely classmates of mine who made beautiful CAD drawings and they had a delicacy to them. And they were also the clumsy me, like where my drawings weren't always so beautiful and delicate. And we're all using the same tools. So there is still kind of a mark of a hand. You can still kind of tell sometimes, oh, this architectural drawing that is extremely technical and made on AutoCAD comes from this firm versus that firm. With that piece, I'd be so curious. So I've made it now with digital tools, but what would it be like for me to try to make the whole thing through flame working or a combination of flame working and casting? I love seeing the kind of like clumps and drips, like when I'm not turning consistently enough and you see things gather in one place. I love that. I love, just like when I look at paintings, I love seeing the accidental drip or the thumbprint. So I'd be so curious because I think it would look totally different. And I think it would have a totally different feeling, even though the concept remains the same. So I'm excited to get good enough to try to make it in glass. And then why flame working? Flame working really hits the spot and is so dear to my heart because as a mom, I don't have a lot of time. And so it's hard for me to coordinate with someone to go to the hot shop together or to need more than two hands. So I think for me, flame working is at a scale that is manageable. It's intimate. So this is like kind of embarrassing, but I'm also kind of really afraid of fire. And so maybe this is the scale of flame that I can tolerate. I like that it allows me to work independently enough. At this moment in my life, things that are intimate in scale work the best for me, even though like there's, I feel like infinite possibilities in front of that torch, which is so exciting. Thank you so much for spending time with me and my practice. It's been so amazing to reflect on my practice and to share it with you. I want to thank all of the glass teachers I've ever had, especially Kim Thomas, and to thank the entire GEEX community and Emily and Helen and everyone on the team that made this experience so good. As I mentioned, I continue to be a glass novice and I hope to get better and to continue to build out my skills. And I would be so grateful for everyone in this community to be a part of this journey. So thank you so much for being here. And hopefully I'll see you in real life sometime.
Thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this lecture, check out previous Geeks Talks episodes featuring Dr. Chitra Ramalingam, Britt Ransom, and Tanya Aguiniga, exclusively available for subscribers in the GEEX Talks archive. The GEEX Talks lecture series features artists and researchers nominated by a community of glass educators, artists, and learners. For anyone seeking their path in this field, GEEX offers you a record of predominantly BIPOC and queer fine artists, craftspeople, scientists, historians, designers, community organizers, and more, working with glass in traditional and unconventional ways. At its essence, GEEX is a grassroots project which has been bootstrapped together by a community that believes in the importance of this effort. Accordingly, GEEX relies on subscriptions, partnerships, and donations to make our public programming possible. GEEX Talk subscriptions are available to institutions like colleges and universities, and individuals outside of academia, whether graduated, self-taught, or curious about glass. You can subscribe or donate to GEEX by visiting geeks.glass/support. Speaker honorariums are drawn from subscribers and supporters. Many thanks to institutional subscribers for believing in the GEEX Talks project. Support for GEEX comes from viewers like you and makes all of GEEX programs and resources possible, including the GEEX Writing Center, BIPOC Community Table, Flame Affinity Group, and GEEX Educators Group. Thanks as well to our organizational partners. Organizational partnerships are intended for craft schools, glass schools, museums, cultural institutions, art service organizations, and really all organizations interested in enriching their resources outside the bounds of their walls. This season of GEEX Talks, specifically the GEEX Shorts format, has been supported by the Wisconsin Special Projects Grant from Ruth Foundation for the Arts. The Wisconsin Special Projects Grant aims to build a robust and equitable arts ecosystem by investing in initiatives that rethink and reimagine past practices, bring an expansive range of voices into public and artistic discourse, and contribute to a more complex and abundant understanding of the histories, lived experiences, and futures of this region. GEEX is based in Madison, Wisconsin, the birthplace of American studio glass. With the support from Ruth Foundation for the Arts, GEEX reconnects Wisconsin's glass history by revitalizing the narratives that define the field in a rapidly changing market, academic, and professional landscape. Thanks to Wet Dog Glass for sponsoring this episode. In business since 1996, Wet Dog Glass delivers unsurpassed value and turnkey hot glass studio equipment, studio planning and consultation, and technical support. Wet Dog Glass, your studio's best friend. Visit their website at wdg-us.com. You can follow GEEX on social media at GeeksGlass on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Sign up for our newsletter to learn more about upcoming programs and events. Finally, many thanks to Kim Harty, Kimberly Thomas, and especially Ani Liu. And of course, thanks to you for listening, sharing, and supporting GEEX Talks. Stay tuned.